You know, it's interesting. When we think about the Holocaust, we tend to focus on the numbers and the
Uh,
dates, but it's so much more than that.
Absolutely.
It's really about, understanding how this could even happen in the first place. And you guys have been asking for a deep dive into this for a while,
Yeah.
and we're finally getting to it. So we've got this excerpt here called 20010322 History of Holocaust.pdf, which lays out the historical facts pretty well. But we really want to go deeper than that, really trying to understand the why and the how.
The motivation.
The motivations exactly, and what choices
Yeah.
were made, how this could have been prevented, and also how
Ripple effect.
the ripple effects. Yeah, exactly how it affects us even today.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to connect all those dots to see how a society, how an entire continent could get to that point,
Yeah.
of perpetrating these acts.
Right. And speaking of the timeline of this whole thing, I mean, it's kind of crazy to think about. Like, we always talk about, Germany in the 1930s
Right.
and how this all kind of went down, but it wasn't like an overnight thing.
No.
Hitler comes to power in 33, but, how did the Nazis, with this ideology
Yeah.
of racial superiority, really gain a foothold
Right.
in a country like Germany?
That's a $1 million question, right? I mean,
Yeah.
how could this happen?
Yeah.
And I think, to really understand it, we have to look at the state that Germany was in,
Right.
especially after World War I.
Yeah,
You had a devastated economy,
of course.
wounded national pride,
Yeah.
and this deep-seated resentment over the Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah.
So the Nazis they exploited this vulnerability brilliantly.
Yeah.
They offered up scapegoats. They offered these simple solutions to
Right.
complex problems.
Yeah.
And then, of course, they used fear and propaganda to silence anyone who disagreed with them.
Right. It's like terrifying how effective propaganda can be.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, were people really that easily swayed by that?
Well, they were in a very vulnerable position.
Right. Yeah.
And the Nazis really honed in on those anxieties.
Huh.
Yeah.
You had hyperinflation that had just wiped out people's savings.
Right.
Unemployment was rampant.
Yeah.
And the Nazis come in, they're promising this economic revival
Right.
to restore Germany to its former glory.
Yeah.
And then on top of all that, they point the finger at the Jews,
Right.
this tiny minority, less than 1% of the population,
Wow.
as the source of all these problems. So
Yeah.
suddenly you have this really complex web of economic and social issues,
Yeah.
and they have a simple answer, a hateful answer.
Right. And that's the thing that just gets me. Like,
Yeah.
this small group of people, less than 1%,
Right.
being seen as such a threat to this entire country.
Well, they were made into the other.
Yeah.
They tapped into those existing anti-Semitic sentiments that,
Yeah.
that were already there, but they weaponized it
Right.
a whole new way. They used
Yeah.
all this modern media,
Yeah.
radio film posters
I
to
agree.
spread their message, and they created this image of Jews as parasites.
Right. As enemies of the state.
Right. And so then they start stripping away their rights
Yes.
little by little. They lose
Right.
their jobs, their businesses, and eventually their citizenship.
It was a very gradual process, this
Oh.
erosion of freedom that we now call dehumanization.
Right.
And the Nuremberg laws of 1935 were a real turning point here,
Yeah.
because that's where they legally defined Jews as second-class citizens
Wow.
and revoked their right to vote and prohibited marriage between Jews and non-Jews.
Yeah, it's just like they're systematically erasing them
Exactly.
from society at this point.
Exactly. And then, of course, comes Kristallnacht,
Right.
the Night of Broken Glass, in November of 1938.
Oh, yeah.
This meticulously organized pogrom,
Wow.
synagogues and Jewish businesses, destroyed homes, ransacked, thousands arrested,
Hmm.
and dozens murdered.
It's just crazy how that was such a clear escalation.
Oh, absolutely.
And then, of course, a preview of what was to come.
A terrifying preview.
Yeah. Do you think that was like a turning point for the German people?
It's hard to say.
Or was it just kind of like,
I think for some,
too late?
it was a
Yeah.
wake-up call, this moment of horror. But for many others, it was just another step
Right.
in the Nazis' consolidation of power. And we have to remember, they'd already created this climate
Of
of fear and silence where opposition was very dangerous.
Right. And it wasn't just Jews who were targeted, right? I mean,
Right.
they had this whole eugenics program.
That's right. Eugenics is this pseudoscience.
Yeah.
It's the belief that you can improve the human population by controlling breeding.
Right.
And in the Nazi context, it becomes this tool for horrific systematic discrimination.
Right.
They target anyone they deem unfit anyone who didn't fit their warped vision of a master race.
So who else kind of fell under that umbrella?
Well, people with disabilities were among the first victims.
Right.
Hundreds of thousands were sterilized against their will.
Oh.
And many were murdered in what the Nazis called the T4 program, a precursor to the death camps.
I was reading about that and how they used gas chambers disguised as showers. It's just horrifying. And what about other groups? Were there any others?
Yes, so the Roma, also known as gypsies,
Right.
they faced persecution, imprisonment, and murder.
Yeah.
Homosexuals were targeted.
Right.
Jehovah's Witnesses and political opponents.
Wow.
It's crucial to understand that the Nazi ideology at its heart was built on exclusion and hate.
Right.
It wasn't limited to one group.
Yeah.
It was a threat to anyone who didn't conform.
Yeah, it's like they were trying to reshape humanity
Yes.
in this twisted image.
And that's a critical insight.
Yeah.
They weren't just eliminating people they deemed undesirable.
Right.
They were creating a new social order.
Right.
One built on fear and obedience.
Right. So by 1939, I mean, Germany's a totalitarian state,
Yeah.
poised for war, and their ideology has just permeated every aspect of life at this point.
Every aspect.
It wasn't just about politics; it was
Right.
about controlling minds.
And that's perhaps the most terrifying aspect of it all.
Yeah.
The Holocaust wasn't just about physical extermination. It was about the systematic dismantling of an entire culture,
Wow.
the suppression of dissent,
Yeah.
the manipulation of truth.
And then, boom, 1939, the world just explodes.
Yeah.
World War II, and the Nazis, their grip on Europe tightens, and, what happens to the Jewish people just gets so much worse.
It's a chilling progression.
Yeah.
What started as discrimination and persecution really escalates into a full-blown genocide.
Yeah.
And with the invasion of Poland, we really see that brutality of Nazi occupation.
Yeah. It wasn't just about, taking over land. It was
Yeah.
about completely dismantling their society.
Exactly. The
Yeah.
Nazis, they saw the Poles as racially inferior,
Right.
an obstacle to their, expansionist ambitions.
Right.
So they targeted intellectuals, community leaders, anyone they saw as a threat.
Right.
Mass executions, deportations, forced labor.
It's just a reign of terror designed to break their spirit.
Absolutely.
And they're also at the same time kind of perfecting their methods of mass murder, right?
Right.
Like with that euthanasia program.
The T4 program, as it was known, was a horrifying precursor to the Holocaust.
Right.
They started with the disabled, the mentally ill, anyone they deemed a burden on society.
Right.
They framed it as mercy killing,
Oh,
a
wow.
way to relieve suffering. But in reality, it was cold-blooded murder,
Yeah.
using gas chambers disguised as showers.
It's like they were trying to desensitize themselves
Yeah.
to the horror of it all,
Exactly. They were testing methods, perfecting techniques,
Mhm.
creating that bureaucratic infrastructure
Wow.
that would later be applied to the genocide of the Jews.
And so that brings us to the final solution. I mean, this is the systematic plan
Yeah.
to just exterminate European Jews.
It was a gradual but deliberate process.
Yeah.
The Wannsee Conference in 1942 is often seen as a pivotal moment.
Okay.
This is where high-ranking Nazi officials met to coordinate the final solution,
Right.
to discuss the logistics of mass murder
Wow.
with chilling bureaucratic efficiency.
So they weren't just driven by this blind hatred. There was a logic to it.
No. There was a cold, calculated logic to it.
That's what's so disturbing.
It is the minutes from that meeting read like a business meeting,
Wow.
a plan for this horrific industrial project.
And we see, that cold efficiency with the Einsatzgruppen, those
Yeah.
mobile killing squads that were operating in the Soviet Union.
Exactly.
Babi Yar, that massacre 33,000 Jews in 2 days.
Yeah.
That was them, right?
That was the Einsatzgruppen, a stark example of their brutality.
Yeah.
They rounded up Jews, forced them to the edge of a ravine, and shot them en masse.
It's just horrific.
Horrific.
And then there's the concentration camp system,
Yeah.
which expands so rapidly during the war.
It wasn't just about concentration camps. The
Mhm.
Nazis created this vast network of imprisonment and exploitation.
Right.
Ghettos,
Mm.
transit camps,
Yeah.
forced labor camps,
Yeah.
all designed to isolate, dehumanize,
Right.
and ultimately eliminate those they deemed enemies of the Reich.
The Warsaw Ghetto, that was one of the largest, right?
The Warsaw Ghetto was essentially an open-air prison
Right.
where hundreds of thousands of Jews were crammed into these squalid conditions.
Yeah.
Disease, starvation, terror were rampant.
It was a slow death.
It was a slow, agonizing death for many.
And if they survived the ghetto,
Right.
then they were sent to concentration camps.
Often deported, yes.
And all the camps weren't created equal, were there?
No, absolutely not.
Different types, different purposes.
Some camps like Dachau were primarily used for political prisoners and forced labor.
Right.
Others like Auschwitz-Birkenau were specifically designed as extermination camps,
Right.
factories of death,
Yeah.
where Jews and other undesirables were systematically murdered upon arrival.
It's hard to even imagine what went on
Unimaginable.
inside those walls.
Auschwitz-Birkenau, with its gas chambers and crematoria,
Right.
stands as this stark monument to the depravity of the Nazi regime.
It's just the scale of the killing is just,
Almost impossible to comprehend.
yeah.
Over 1 million people were murdered.
Mm.
They're most of them Jews.
And they use Zyklon B gas, right?
Yes. Zyklon B, a pesticide, was the primary method.
Wow.
A horrifically efficient way to kill large numbers of people.
The level of cruelty, the calculated nature of it all, it's
Keep you wrong.
beyond comprehension. You know, it's hard to even think about hope amidst all this, but even in those camps, there were acts of resistance.
Right.
What farms did that even take when, just surviving each day? It was such a struggle.
It's a really inspiring but also heartbreaking question. Armed uprisings were rare.
Right.
But resistance took many forms.
Yeah.
Acts of sabotage, stealing food to feed others,
Yeah.
holding on to cultural practices,
Yeah.
even sharing stories to keep spirits alive. It was about maintaining that human dignity, in the face of just unimaginable dehumanization.
We always hear about the Danish resistance and how they smuggled
Right.
almost their entire Jewish population to safety. Were there any other large-scale rescue efforts like that?
The Danish resistance was truly remarkable.
Yeah.
But there were other instances of collective action. In Bulgaria, for example, widespread protests,
Wow.
led by religious figures and politicians, actually prevented the deportation of Bulgarian Jews.
Wow. That's amazing.
And individuals across Europe risked their lives to hide Jews,
Yeah.
forge documents, and help them escape.
Wow.
People like Roel Wallenberg,
I've heard that name.
a Swedish diplomat in Budapest,
Yeah.
who issued protective passports and established safe houses,
Wow.
saving tens of thousands.
These stories are just incredible.
They are?
But it makes you wonder, why wasn't there more action from the outside world?
Right.
Why didn't the Allied powers do more?
It's a question that continues to haunt us.
Yeah.
The Allied response was complex and, frankly, inadequate.
Yeah.
There were logistical challenges, of course,
Right.
but there was also this failure to grasp the scale and the urgency of the situation.
Right.
And sadly, anti-Semitism played a role,
Wow.
as did the focus on winning the war, which often overshadowed rescue efforts.
It's just a reminder that even when faced with genocide, things like politics and prejudice can just really hinder our compassion.
Absolutely.
And then there's the aftermath. Millions dead families shattered.
Yeah.
A continent just completely scarred.
Yeah.
What happened to the survivors?
Many of them faced a world that no longer felt like home.
Right.
They'd lost families, homes, communities.
Everything.
Some were unable or unwilling to return to places where they'd experienced such trauma.
Of course.
So they became displaced persons refugees, searching for a new beginning.
And they weren't exactly met with open arms everywhere, were they?
Sadly, no. The world was still reeling from the war.
Yeah.
And many countries, including the U.S. and Britain,
Right.
had these really restrictive immigration policies.
Right.
And anti-Semitism still lingered,
Yeah.
making it even more difficult for survivors to find refuge.
There's that story of the Exodus in 1947.
Yes.
The ship carrying thousands of Holocaust survivors trying to reach Palestine,
Right.
only to be turned back by the British.
It's a heartbreaking image, a
Yeah.
symbol of the ongoing struggles that they faced.
Absolutely. And it really just highlights the challenges, but
Yeah.
also their resilience.
Exactly.
Mm.
There were organizations like the Jewish Brigade Group
Right.
that worked tirelessly to help survivors.
Yeah.
And eventually, pressure mounted and policies shifted.
Right.
The U.S. passed the Displaced Persons Act in 1948,
Okay.
allowing more refugees to enter.
Yeah.
And, of course, the creation of the State of Israel in the same year
Right.
offered a homeland for many.
It wasn't a perfect solution,
No.
but it was a glimmer of hope
It was.
amidst all that darkness.
Yeah.
And we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From the rise of Nazi ideology to the horrors of the Holocaust
Right.
and the aftermath. It's a lot to process.
It's essential to remember, though, that the Holocaust isn't just a chapter in history.
Right.
It's a stark warning, a reminder of what can happen when hate and intolerance take root.
And that brings us back to the question we asked at the beginning. Could something like this happen again?
It's a question we have to constantly ask ourselves.
Yeah.
we see echoes of the past in the rise of nationalism, xenophobia,
Yeah.
and anti-Semitism around the world.
It's a reminder that those seeds of hate are always there,
Yeah.
just waiting for the right conditions to grow.
Right.
So what can we do? What can each of us do?
I think it starts with education,
Yeah,
with understanding the factors that led to the Holocaust,
right.
recognizing the warning signs, calling out hate speech,
Yeah.
and actively combating prejudice in all its forms.
Remembering the victim.
Remembering the victim.
Honoring their memory by fighting for a more just and compassionate world.
A world where never again is more than just a slogan,
Right.
but a promise we actively strive to fulfill.
Well, thank you for joining us on this difficult
Yeah,
but very essential deep dive.
absolutely.
They can't forget the past,
No.
but we can learn from it and use that knowledge to build a better future.
Yes.
A future where the horrors of the Holocaust are never repeated.
Yes,